Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Tuesday, March 12th, 2013, getting midway through the month, coming up on the official start of spring, although pretty much most people in the northern latitudes could be confused if they were wondering just where the heck that went. We'll be talking about that later on in the show. Obviously today, the corporate media is just spending vast amounts of time on the start of conclave. The Cardinals are locked into their room and they're conducting their vote, or I don't know, maybe they're playing a high-stakes poker game. And whoever comes out with the aces high, gets to be the Pope or something like that. Maybe they're wrestling. Best 3 falls out of 5 gets to be the Pope. But I did want to comment on the way they conduct the election. And if you saw the movie Angels and Demons, they sort of showed how it was, where each one of the cardinals walks up holding his ballot over his head, puts it in this bowl. One cardinal will take out the ballot, announce who it's for, pass it to a second cardinal who will repeat who it's for, and a third cardinal then writes it down. Then it goes to a second set of 3 cardinals who do exactly the same thing. And of course, every cardinal in the room is running their own tally. That is how you run an election, to make sure there's no fraud. I noticed there's no Diebold machines in conclave. They don't have these little buttons on the armrests of the seat where the cardinal can reach over real quick and hit the other button like we see so much in America's legislatures. Got to give them credit for that one. They know how to run an honest election, and from the way they run it, they know election fraud is a huge reality. And corporate media was doing a big thing about showing all the cardinals coming up, putting their hands on the Bible, and swearing oaths of secrecy, like they're not going to tell us who wins the election or something. And I think probably inside their own mind they're saying, I swear I will never talk about child molestation ever again. And if I do, may God strike me a glancing blow. Obviously, this scandal is continuing to be magnified by the attention on the papacy. We're seeing all these organizations of clergy sex abuse victims who are basically coming out and saying there are certain candidates who should not be considered for Pope because of their involvement in the cover-up of this scandal. And I think they're absolutely right. As Richard Nixon used to say, it isn't the crime that's going to get you, it's the cover-up that enrages people. Because a cover-up is basically perceived as an admission of guilt. When you try and sweep it under the carpet, or you bury it in the legislature, or you have an unending investigation that goes nowhere, that's what makes people think you're guilty, and you're trying to hide it. And the scandal continues to grow. It's been a long time building. And the new Pope, I do not envy him the job. Not at all. Now, obviously, with all the attention on the papacy and the cardinals and the Catholic Church and their sexual scandals, apparently there's a big uproar over the fact that the Catholic Church owns this large block of apartments in which many of the church leaders are living. And apparently in this same building is Europe's largest gay sauna. They used to have those in the United States. They got banned during the start of the AIDS epidemic. They still have them in Europe. And apparently one of the most anti-gay cardinals is living in that building above this big gay sauna. And people are scratching their heads and wondering what's going on with that situation. Now, speaking of religious furor, there's a photo that's been all over the corporate media showing Ahmadinejad consoling Chavez's mother with a hug. And it seems like a very touching moment that nobody could find fault with. But apparently this is a violation of Muslim law, that you're not allowed to touch women, not your wife, unless they are drowning and you must render assistance. And Iran's religious community is in an uproar over this, but there is more to this photo than meets the eye. We'll talk about it when we come back from these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Manny is sitting in our control room today, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phones when you call on in. So we're talking about these photos all over the corporate media of Ahmadinejad consoling Hugo Chavez's mother down there at the funeral. Seems a very touching thing. The propaganda value of this photo, of course, is twofold. First of all, with all of the screaming by the Islamic clergy in Iran, Americans could be forgiven for saying, "What? They're being completely unreasonable. This is a very touching human thing for him to be consoling the mother, and what's the big deal about that?" And of course, within Iran itself, this image is going to cause problems for Ahmadinejad himself, dealing with the local religious community. But it turns out this photo appears to be another fake. Little better quality than the one they did of the ones, plural, they did of the dead Osama, but we've already located the original source image from which the fake was made. So somebody, again, is playing fast and loose with the Photoshop for propaganda purposes, and it's why you should never, ever take anything you're seeing on the corporate media at face value. Speaking of which, now, when Osama's son-in-law was arrested and sent to New York, I asked here on the air, why was he going to New York and not Guantanamo with all the other terror suspects? And I speculated at the time, this is a publicity stunt. They're going to use him for some propaganda purpose, either to reaffirm the official story of 9/11 or for some other reason, and now it turns out, it appears I was correct, because now we're getting the story that's coming out here. CNN is reporting that this Osama's son-in-law spent time in Iran. Oh my goodness, there's Al-Qaeda in Iran. We've got to hate them because Al-Qaeda's in Iran, even though supposedly the U.S. is funding Al-Qaeda in Syria and various other places. Al-Qaeda are just hired mercenaries, and they'll wear the label Al-Qaeda when necessary. But this is just more propaganda. They're not getting traction with this idea that Iran is building weapons of mass destruction. Nobody's buying that after the whopper about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. So they're looking for something else that will get traction with the American people, to urge them on to throw their children onto the Iranian bayonets with wild, reckless, patriotic fury. So now it's, again, Al-Qaeda. Ooh, Al-Qaeda's in Iran. We must attack them because Al-Qaeda is there. And that was the reason they brought him to New York and arraigned him in the New York court, to give him publicity, to give him visibility, so he could stand up there and say, oh yes, I was in Iran, they have Al-Qaeda. Speaking of unrealistic portrayals of Iran, apparently Iran is suing the studios and distributors of the movie Argo over unrealistic, inaccurate portrayals of Iran and Iranians. So they're suing for defamation. Meanwhile, John Bolton, as always, is out there saying Israel has a very short period of time to strike Iran. Said Tehran is going to have nuclear weapons beyond Israel's reach. He's out there just with his short skirt and his pom-poms going, go Israel, attack Iran. Rah, rah, rah. Well, John, here's your rifle. Here's your parachute. Watch your step climbing into that transport plane. We'll be sure and call Iran and tell them you're on your way to whip their butt all by yourself. But after that whopper, you and all these other pro-war Israel firsters told us about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, we're going to sit this one out and keep our children safe at home. I think when we talk about the blueprint for the new America, we should have a law in there that any president or Congress critter or other official that argues for war in a foreign land, their own children should be on the front lines of the first invasion wave. I think war, when it was fought in older times, had a good idea. The leaders led their own troops. Napoleon led his own troops. Washington led his own troops. Stalin put his own sons on the front lines, lost 3 of them. Alexander the Great led his own troops. Now we have these war enthusiasts sitting safely in their bunkers and their command posts in Washington, D.C., while other people's children are out there being killed and crippled. And I think that sort of incentivizes war. We need to disincentivize war by making it a personal risk to those who call for war. Absolutely. More propaganda out there yet. They're talking about this new American Al-Qaeda, this U.S.-trained soldier who became Muslim, and he's moving between America and countries and fighting along jihadist and American-hating terrorists, and they're fanning him up. He's going to be the new Adam Gadon. And the old Adam Gadon is being retired because everybody now knows his real name is Adam Perlman. He's a phony. And he's used for propaganda purposes. So they're going to retire him. This is the understudy. This is your chance at stardom. Go on out there and terrorize. Put it up on YouTube. So we can warn everybody that Al-Qaeda is in America. And that's the reason we have to take away the Bill of Rights. Now, Obama, ahead of his trip to the region next week, is trying to push for Israel-Turkey reconciliation. Good luck on that one. Israel says it's willing to take steps, but is unsure whether Erdogan is interested in mending ties. Now, what Israel means by Erdogan mending ties is for Erdogan to stop asking Israel to apologize for murdering those Turkish activists in international waters a couple of years back. You can only be a friend of Israel if you do as you are told, when you are told to do it, and never, ever, ever, ever mention anything Israel does wrong. Sorry about that. That was a technical mistake at my end. Ehud Barak is out there saying Israel can't rely on their friends' help in dealing with Israel's enemies. Despite all the pledges made to defend Israel, Israel can't rely on them. Now, Israel's idea of a friend, like I said above, someone who will do what they're told to do when they're told to do it. And Israel's trying to get America to fight yet another war against Israel's enemies. And I imagine Israel's very frustrated because they know America has plenty of their own agenda and motive for going into Iran. Lock Iran's oil back to the dollar. As part of that whole global dollarification, trying to force the world back onto Bretton Woods at the point of a bayonet. And Israel doesn't understand why here in the United States of America, the U.S. government is not building huge popular support for yet another war on yet another resource-rich area that just coincidentally happens to be somebody Israel does not like. Israel is now saying that they're convinced Israel is going to be the next target of Syrian rebels, the hired mercenaries. Now, regardless of which side they're on in Syria, whether they're on Assad's side or the hired mercenary army's side, they've got a lot of stuff to do. They got better things to do than start threatening Israel right now. So what is going on here is Israel wants to grab a bigger piece of Syria. They want to go past the Golan Heights. Apparently some online maps are already showing the seized Golan Heights, the occupied territory, as part of Israel proper. Try and convince everybody, oh, the Golan Heights, that's Israel, and now we need a new security buffer. So here comes the propaganda campaign. As Syria's situation deteriorates, Israel's going to move in and grab another chunk of Syria and claim it's their new security zone, as they tend to do here. Now, getting back to Hugo Chavez and following the funeral, the American media is just pounding on him. Pounding, 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 pounding. What an evil tyrant he was. He was bad. We can never allow another one like him to take power. Now, had Hugo Chavez followed the pattern of many of the other third world leaders and concentrated on siphoning off Venezuela's wealth for personal gain and for those of favored corporations, nobody would have paid any attention to him. But Hugo Chavez redirected vast sums of national wealth to the Venezuelan people. Free health care, free education, something we don't have in the United States any longer. And that's why he alienated the money junkies, who are used to looting a nation's wealth for their own aggrandizement. And Hugo Chavez's championing of ordinary people is why he was so popular. And he was an inspiration to many other South American nations who decided to go along that same path. And that's why he was such a threat. And they were trying to overthrow him. He was a unifying force. And so I'm anticipating we will see intervention, to put it politely, in the upcoming Venezuelan elections. To put another money junkie, pro-banker, pro-austerity, pro-global reserve bank puppet into power. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department is reiterating sanctions against Pakistan over their pipeline to Iran. Because by golly, you will not buy Iranian oil unless it's being sold for dollars. And I think this is a really bad move because Pakistan's alliance, if you will, friendship with the West is already strained by all these drone strikes. And sanctions against Pakistan is going to drive Pakistan into the Russian-Chinese BRIC sphere of influence. And it's beginning to look like America's foreign policy is lacking any kind of pattern or self-consistency. It's totally reactive. Do what we like, we'll do things for you. Do something we don't like, we won't, we'll do terrible things to you. That's not a good plan. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, over in Afghanistan, things are getting difficult. We have the situation where Hamid Karzai is actually starting to take his job seriously, and he's starting to challenge U.S. policy. He intervened in the case of those U.S. forces that had captured a university and were just torturing the students, trying to find something that they could use, or maybe just trying to create enough hostility to stimulate more attacks against the U.S. forces, trying to build a case for keeping the U.S. in Afghanistan past 2014. Karzai's even gone so far as to say that the U.S. Is negotiating with the Taliban to try and create a situation to justify keeping forces past 2014. The European press has been reporting on how Great Britain and the United States are actually bribing the Taliban to allow truck convoys to go where they need to go. So the overall analysis of all of these stories, and this is coming out of antiwar.com, is the Afghanistan war is falling apart at the seams. Now remember, yesterday President Karzai was supposed to meet with the new Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, and they canceled it over security concerns. This is in the capital, right in the heart, the most secure area. And Hagel's visit, of course, has coincided with all these incidents showing that the U.S. occupation, now in its 12th year, is flying apart at the seams. Insider attacks and popular opposition are on the rise. They want their country back. And Karzai seems to be listening to his own people, which is the kiss of death from the point of view of the U.S. foreign policy. They don't call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires for nothing. The British learned it, the Russians learned it, and now the U.S. is learned it. Now, getting back to the situation there in Iraq, it is time to realize that we got snookered. We, the American people, we got cheated. We got defrauded. Remember back in 2003, after Bush lied to everybody during his State of the Union speech about how Iraq was buying yellow cake uranium from Niger, which turned out to be a complete lie based on a rather badly forged set of documents, had the wrong letterhead, had the wrong signatures, and Iraq has plenty of natural uranium in their own borders. They don't need to buy it from anywhere else. After Bush got done lying about that, and he got his war going, he told the American people that it was going to cost $50 to $60 billion to overthrow Saddam Hussein and establish a functioning government, and that it would all be paid for out of Iraq's oil revenues. We were going to make Iraq pay for its own conquest. Well, the war in Iraq has cost at least $800 billion from 2003 to 2011. We don't have figures for last year. And when you factor in the long-term costs of caring for the wounded and the families of those who died, the cost of the Iraq war is pushing $4 trillion. But I guess it was worth it because we got those weapons of mass destruction. Oh, they didn't have any of those, right. Well, at least we ended Iraq's support for Al-Qaeda. And, oh no, wait, they were actually enemies. But at least we had revenge for the attack on the World Trade. No, that's right, Iraq wasn't involved in that. Bush admitted that on video. The reality is there never was a way to win the war in Iraq in the public eye, because every justification for the war in Iraq was a lie. We couldn't get Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. He didn't have any. We couldn't punish them for 9/11. Iraq had nothing to do with it. We couldn't punish Iraq for aiding al-Qaeda. They were actually enemies. Al-Qaeda, the ones who really think there is an al-Qaeda and don't realize they're working for CIA and Mossad, they're in favor of theocratic rule, and Saddam's was the only secular government in the region. If Saddam had given al-Qaeda weapons of mass destruction, al-Qaeda probably would have turned around and used them on Saddam. So whatever the real objectives were, concealed from the people, the Iraq War can never be won in the political sense. It can never be won in terms of those claims made to the American people, because they were all lies. There's no victory possible in the public relations sense here. Now, an interesting story, and this is coming out of political ticker blogs at CNN. The United States Marines over there in the war zones are being told to conserve ammunition because of the spending cuts. At the same time, we are being told the Department of Homeland Security is buying billions of hollow point rounds potentially to use on the American people. So either this story about the DHS buying all these rounds is total nonsense. There's a disconnect. If they're running out of ammunition in the war zone, yeah, I know hollow points aren't legal in war, but send something over there. These two stories really don't reconcile. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And looking at the corporate media, the cameras are still focused on that chimney coming out of where Conclave is meeting. And it's kind of amazing in the age of instant communication technology around the world that the signal is still the burning of the ballots with the powders to color the smoke black or white. And it's been problematic. If you remember back during the conclave that elected Pope Benny the Rats, the wind was blowing so hard nobody could really see what color the smoke was. And it wasn't until the bells started ringing that they finally realized, oh, I think that last smoke was white. One of the commentators on the corporate media was saying, why don't they just go to the Grucci family and get some fireworks and send up, boom, red, no pope, boom, green, we've got a pope, make it a little bit more obvious. Or let's get into the 21st century, send out a tweet. We got one, and everybody starts gathering for the party. Now, on to some more serious news here. North Korea, as we've been mentioning, they're really big on bluster. But I really don't think they're going to start flinging nuclear weapons all over the place. And unfortunately, because of cultural custom in that part of the world regarding face, backing down is very, very difficult. In fact, it's true of diplomacy around the world, and that's why the world gets into such trouble. People start making exaggerated statements and then they can't back off. And they figure, rather than me suffer the embarrassment of admitting I was wrong and backing down, let's send off several million of our children into a new war. But apparently, and we're getting this from Investment Watch blog, North Korea is now threatening nuclear attacks on Turkmenistan, Iceland. Why? I'm sure the private central banks would like Iceland to go away, but not North Korea, and even New Zealand. And supposedly the reason for New Zealand is that back during when the Korean War was first cranking up, there were troops from New Zealand supporting South Korea. And so North Korea is blaming everybody. Now let's get realistic here. North Korea, unless they bought one from Israel, North Korea does not have a deployable nuclear weapon. Yes, they're conducting underground tests of a very primitive nature. But it's a long way between something that you can assemble inside a tunnel underground and something small and light enough to fit on North Korea's known missiles. And it's a given North Korea's missiles will not reach Iceland, may not be able to reach New Zealand. It all depends on how heavy that warhead is. So I think North Korea has just undermined their credibility by coming out with these latest threats here. And I would not put it past some world power to set off a nuclear bomb to blame North Korea or Iran. But I certainly don't see Iran starting a nuclear war for historical reasons. And North Korea, they have a long tradition of bluff and bluster. And I think they just jumped the shark on this one, saying they're going to nuke Iceland. Now, we were talking yesterday about this horrible SUV crash where 6 teenagers were killed, and how we should use this to call for a ban on either SUVs or teenagers, along the same line as the gun grabbers scream, "Grab the guns," for every mishap with the guns. And pointed out how silly that was, because you're dealing with irresponsible behavior, not with the machine. We know drunk drivers kill more people than gun owners. And remember, 2/3 of those gun deaths they wave at you are suicides. You take away the guns, they'll do something else. Rope, pills, jump off a tall building, walk into a biker bar and scream, "All you bikers suck." Wet their nose, stick it in a lamp socket, something like that. It turns out now these teenagers stole the SUV, went joyriding, they weren't even wearing their seat belts. And obviously behavior like this, and it's tragic for the families of the teenagers who died. But we're dealing with irresponsible behavior, not the car. We shouldn't be calling for a ban on SUVs or no cars with a passenger capacity above 3 so that we can avoid the mass deaths from these large 6, 8-seat SUVs. We correctly say this is bad behavior on the part of these kids who stole the car. And the same should be true about the guns and gun owners. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later. In the hoist with your own petard department, and no, it's not as dirty as it sounds, apparently a senator, female senator, tweeted about getting groped by the TSA. Senator McCaskill was trying to get on a flight on Monday, flying just like ordinary people, and basically that, she was randomly selected for a pat-down, and the experience was not a pleasant one. Well, welcome to our world. And so she tweeted to her 89,000 followers, "Got private, more aggressive pat-down, OMG, very uncomfortable." And I think maybe if all members of Congress had to go through that, if Obama and his family had to go through that, they might start relaxing the TSA a little bit. Of course, right now, where everybody's supposed to pay attention over the ban on knives and Swiss Army knives, and they had the pilot, that hero pilot, who after his plane hit the flight of birds was able to land it, belly flop it in the Hudson and save everybody. And they had him on the air, and he's saying, "Oh, no, even 2-inch blades could be used to ill purpose." So he is definitely out in high dudgeon. We dare not allow Swiss Army knives onto the airplanes. You know what's really funny? Right after 9/11, I'd been invited to speak at this conference on computer animation up in Montreal. And the security was already completely nutso, and we had to go through pat-down, luggage search, everything. They put us on the plane. The in-flight meal was a steak dinner complete with a steel steak knife. Good thinking, good planning on all of this stuff. And it's just nonsense. Going into Canada was wonderful. Hi, welcome to Canada. How are you? Have fun. Have some tourist brochures. Be sure and see blah, 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 blah. Coming back into the United States is, "Get up against the wall, spread your feet." Who wants to come to the United States with that? And it has. It's disrupted tourism all across the country. We feel it here in Hawaii. But the people who invested in Michael Chertoff's company, after he mandated all this stuff, he left the government and started a company to provide all this stuff he himself had ordered the government to buy. And he's rich, and all of his investors are rich, and they're laughing their heads off. They're making money hand over fist. Every time your wife or daughter gets groped in the genitalia, Chertoff gets a dividend check. That's what it's really all about, the security industrial complex. Up in Detroit, former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick was found guilty Monday for federal corruption charges, for scheming to enrich himself and his close confidants while he was in office. I've had a lot of people ask me why in the categories at whatreallyhappened.com you have politics and corruption as one category. Don't they always go together? Isn't that why most people go into politics, for that opportunity to sell out to the corruptors and make a fast buck? In the blueprint for the new America, all elected officials should have their wealth in a blind trust. Not just the president, and even the presidents cheat about that. We saw that back during the Clinton administration, during the Whitewater testimony. One of the White House maids admitted before Congress that the Clintons had a filing cabinet full of their own financial papers up in the residence. They're not supposed to do that. It was a scam. They put some of their money in the blind trust, but it was a fraud, which I think was the reason why Vince Foster was going to resign without signing those papers. Then his body is found in Fort Marcy Park, and the blind trust papers are signed by somebody using Foster's name 3 days later. Now, talking about the economy, today the stock market's sort of, it's a little down, not enough to get excited about, but obviously the upward rush is fizzling. But we're seeing more and more experts come forward, like Counterpunch, basically saying this huge upsurge was fueled entirely by the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing. They're pouring money into these financial centers, and the financial centers are getting it at 2%. I'm just pulling that number out of the thin air. They go over to the stock market, they buy stocks, the stocks go up, they sell out, they pay back the loan, and they still have money left over. They've made a fast buck. That's what stock market speculation is about. They're not buying and selling the stocks for their underlying value and the earnings from the company whose stock it is. They're simply buying and selling to ride the volatility. And the more volatility there is, the faster they can make a lot of money. And that money is not created out of thin air. It has to come from somebody else, crushing the short sellers or taking it out of the value of the underlying company. It's all fraudulent activity. It does not benefit the economy, doesn't benefit the society, doesn't benefit the nation, and it just keeps on going. Now, over in France, they're now concerned about a triple-dip recession. Their automobile industry is in serious trouble. They're not able to sell cars or export cars. Why? Nobody has the money to buy a new car, and nobody wants to take out another car loan because they don't know if they're going to have the job to pay for it 6 months, a year down the road. It's just all across the Eurozone. And it all gets back to that whole 11th marble. Israel's getting ready to possibly have second elections because the pro-banker, pro-austerity party is unwilling to form a coalition government underneath Beppe Grillo. And by the way, I posted a video from back when he was still being a comedian talking about the society and the economy. He's the Italian version of George Carlin. And I can see why the Italian people love this guy and voted him in. But it looks like they're going to have second elections. We're going to see a replay of exactly what happened in Greece. First election is anti-banker. Derail that government, force a second election, force a pro-banker government into power. Israel is already out there screaming that Beppe Grillo is an anti-Semite. Ooh, we can't have him as ruler of Italy. He's an anti-Semite. We can't have a ruler of any country that doesn't love Israel. They're already at it. They're already at it. Switzerland's having a bad week, and not just from the record cold they're dealing with. There was the criminal sentencing in the United States of Bank Wegland, their oldest bank. And they're going to have to shut down. Wegland was the first foreign bank to be indicted for assisting U.S. money junkies to evade taxes, the first to plead guilty, and now the first to be sentenced. Wegland assumed that since it did not have any branches outside of Switzerland and complied with Swiss law, it was in the clear and out of reach of the U.S. government. Obviously, they were wrong. And I'm wondering why Switzerland is not up in arms over a violation of their sovereignty. And again, financial globalism leads to political globalism. All one country, one government, underneath one reserve bank, issuing the global currency as a loan at interest. Italy's economy is shrinking. The European Union is warning of a new lost generation. Now that term gets bandied around a lot and usually follows a major world war. And it refers to a generation that is so dispirited by what they have been through that they give up trying. And they're useless as a labor force to rebuild an economy and a society. Whether you call it the beatnik generation, Generation X, they just sort of get through life any way they can because they've been through that trauma of seeing everything they ever worked for utterly destroyed. And it's going to happen again. And what we're seeing now, we're seeing it happen again as a result of the economic predations, not the war. Before, they could blame the war for these lost generations. But we're starting to see those symptoms here before the war really gets going, and that tells us it really was the economic downturns that were doing it. People spend their lives working, buying a house, building a business, and it all gets taken away by the money junkies. And you can hardly blame them for sitting down and saying, why should I try any longer? Doesn't matter what I do. Doesn't matter how hard I work. The money junkies and the governments who work for the money junkies are just going to take it away. So heck, I'm just going to quit. I'm going to go down to the beach here and carve coconut shells for the tourists. And I'll just get by that way. And I'll live out my life and I'll enjoy life day to day. And I'm not going to be part of that system any longer. I'm not going to be part of the greater society. And we're starting to see that malaise, that nihilism, spreading across Europe. And we're seeing it here in the United States. I know a lot of people who were very successful, lost it all following 2008 and the collapse of the mortgage-backed security fraud. And they're saying, why should I work harder? Why should I try and get a better job? It's just going to be taken away again. Over in Europe, we've been talking about the hungry here in the United States, or the food challenged, or the food insecure, whatever politically correct euphemism you want to use. But apparently over in Europe, millions of Europeans are now relying on the Red Cross for supplemental food to get them through. In all these areas where there's massive unemployment and austerity, and government policies in Europe, like government policies here in the United States of America, are just making the problem worse. Nobody will learn the lesson of Iceland. Nobody will dare stand up to the private central banks and say, you are the cause of all of this, with your 11th marble, your debt-based currency, your system that by design creates more debt than money to pay that debt. We don't have very many courageous rulers in power. And those that we do definitely are orchestrated against. Ron Paul, Beppe Grillo, Hugo Chavez. The money junkies are ruling the world to feed their money junkie addiction, and they will not tolerate any nation, any leader, any individual standing up and saying, I refuse to live under this system any longer. So, over in Great Britain now, they're worried about a triple dip recessions. Manufacturing is slumping. Their treasury is ordering steroids for the stalled bank lending scheme over there. They're saying they have to have more quantitative easing. I'll tell you why when we come back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And the black smoke is pouring out of conclave. So the Cardinals are ending their first day of conclave without having chosen a pope, which was kind of expected. You know, now everybody knows who's got the political support, and they'll go off and they'll talk amongst themselves and basically see what's going on. So we'll see what's going to happen with this situation. Now, getting back to what I was talking about before the commercial break. All of these economic systems in all of these nations with private central banks issuing the public currency as a loan at interest are failed. They are all being propped up by all this instant money creation from the Federal Reserve, quantitative easing. Over in Britain, they're calling it steroids, is their code phrase for it. And if you want an analogy, it's like you have this comatose body lying on a hospital bed. And they're trying to keep it alive by pumping new blood into the brain, but only the brain, to keep it alive. Now, a brain without a body can't do much of anything except admire itself for its brainliness. But that's what they're doing with these quantitative easing systems. They're keeping the financial centers alive on paper, and the rest of the nation is dying around them, and they don't see it because they're getting their goodies. And for those who worship on the altar of Adam Smith, which is most of them, they figure if they're doing good, then all is well with the world. But we're out here looking at the rest of the body, and yeah, the brain is doing good, it's getting all the oxygen and all the nutrients, and it's still thinking and scheming and plotting, but the rest of the body is clearly dying. And certainly they cannot keep this up forever, because all this instant money creation, even though it's considered technically a debt to be repaid when times are better down the road, one of the biggest lies of our modern era, it's still devaluing the currency to the point where other nations are just not going to want to deal with this. All right, we're going to grab a phone call real quick. Tate in Michigan. Aloha, Tate. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. I wanted to tell you, I was on the phone yesterday with Max Kaiser, financial analyst, and we were talking about wealth preservation and possible dual citizenship and different things to protect wealth. And he had mentioned investing into Bitcoin, and I was wondering if you know much about the peer-to-peer digital currency. It's an alternative currency that central banks don't control the inflation amount.
In theory, I think it's actually a good idea as long as there are controls where it can't be inflated, and I don't see those in place yet. My original opposition to Bitcoin was related to the process called Bitcoin mining, where you would have your computer crunching away at these encryption blocks. And, over time you would, wasn't watching the clock. Tate, stay with me. I'm going to come back to you on this after station identification. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here, and we're talking with Tate in Michigan about Bitcoin. My concerns about Bitcoin are twofold. As I mentioned before we went to the break, there doesn't seem to be a mechanism to prevent Bitcoin from being manipulated or inflated. And indeed, when Bitcoin first came around and they were talking about how it was gaining in value, and then there was a crash and people actually lost some real wealth in that. So it seems to have many of the same problems as any other fiat declared currency. It's not tied to anything of absolute value. And that's one reason why while obviously we need a peer-to-peer commerce system, I think the underlying currency itself has to be tied to a unit of value. Maybe CPU cycles, RAM, electricity is something I favor for that. The other reason I tended to ignore Bitcoin early on was this process of Bitcoin mining, where you would basically have this software running on your computer that was chewing away at these blocks of encrypted data, and after so many blocks were done, you would get so many Bitcoins. I remember a very, very good friend of mine locally was tying up a $5,000 computer 24 hours a day to get $35 worth of Bitcoins, which didn't sound very good. And I noticed that at the same time all of these Bitcoin mining systems were spreading across the globe is when we began to see a lot of public key protected financial institutions fall to hackers. And my concern at the time was Bitcoin mining was actually a crowdsourced key-breaking system, because the conventional wisdom is that you can go obviously from private key to public key, but you can't go from public key back to private key. That's not entirely true. With enough computer power, you can get the private key from the publicly available key in this Whitfield-Diffie public key encryption system. And so I was very concerned that Bitcoin mining was actually a very covert, crowdsourced way of finding those private keys. And that's why I stayed away from Bitcoin. As far as Bitcoin itself is concerned, I still have the concern that there's no way to keep it from inflating. And it's open to manipulation. It's a first effort, and I think it's a foundation on which to consider making currency virtual in the future, but it does have to be tied to something of value in order to stabilize it in order to prevent, again, seeing the same kind of financial games we're seeing now. Tate, are you there? I guess not. Tate hung up. Oh, Tate, are you there? I still can't hear Tate.
I guess not.
Okay, all right, thanks an awful lot. Now, over at goldseek.com, they're starting to say that the 70-year debt supercycle has come to an end. And they're absolutely correct. The debt is unsustainable, even with austerity. We are hearing countries in Europe are still going to have to dump the euro, break out of the eurozone, go back to their own currencies, and devalue them in order to have a chance of bringing business and investment back into their country. And they're absolutely right. But the biggest bond problem of all is one that nobody wants to talk about, and that is the U.S. Treasury bond, which has been the beneficiary of a reputation of being the most secure investment in the world. And it may well have been up until about 30 years ago. But we know that all of this quantitative easing coming out of the Federal Reserve is preceded by corresponding Treasury bonds issued by the U.S. Treasury. And a Treasury bond is basically redeemable in your future slave labor. More on this when we come back from these commercials. And aloha America, welcome back to the show. And we're talking about U.S. Treasury bonds. Now, following the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, just about 100 years ago, the U.S. government stopped issuing their own currency, and they started issuing Treasury bonds. Now, these bonds are sent over to the Federal Reserve and represent a request for a loan in Federal Reserve currency. And the Federal Reserve will then print up Federal Reserve notes, or more recently type into a computer, back to the government, that currency. But instead of the government printing its own currency interest-free, the government is now borrowing that currency at interest from that private central bank. The Federal Reserve note, through those Treasury bonds, is backed up by the future slave labor of Americans. You, your children, your children's children, your children's children's children. That's what backs up the U.S. currency, is slave labor. Because when the government takes wealth away from you in taxes and gives you nothing back for it, that is enslavement. Now, the Federal Reserve can't create new U.S. legal tender currency without a corresponding Treasury bond. So for all this quantitative easing that we're seeing going on to Wall Street, there are corresponding Treasury bonds. And now there is a Treasury bond bubble, because there aren't enough living Americans, even with these soon-to-be-made legal illegal aliens, to redeem all those Treasury bonds. Now, the Treasury bonds are being held together by their former reputation. They're propped up by their reputation as being absolute ironclad, reliable investments. But they're being bubbled up. And when that one goes, it will be the end. One of the many things here. The reality is, our entire economy, our entire pyramid system banking scheme, was always based on the idea that the next generation would be better and wealthier, and we could pay off all the accumulated debts then. But it's not happening. Americans can't afford the future that is required by this Ponzi scheme central banking system. Period. End of discussion. Back to the phones. Tony in Indiana. Aloha, Tony. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hi, Mike. Nice to talk to you again. It's been a while. Just want to touch base on what you were talking about last week. Well, I think it was maybe Thursday or Friday. It was about the gold situation where, well, first it was Germany, now Mexico is wanting to audit their gold in England, if not that, maybe even repatriate it. My question is, let's assume that some of this gold is missing.
Yes.
Here's the million-dollar question. what do you think they did with it? Did they make themselves expensive watches with it? Did they just pocket it? I mean, what did they do with it if they did take some of it?
Okay, I think what happened with it is really quite explainable if you look at the gold futures contracts, the paper gold contracts, that have been flooding onto the market to keep gold prices down, to discourage investors from leaving the equities markets and going into metals. And so I think what happened is every time gold prices would start up and people would start selling stocks and buying gold, these gold traders would dump huge numbers of these contracts onto the market to drive gold prices back down. Then when the contracts would come due, the gold brokers would go to the holder of the contract and say, look, we'll buy the contract back for its current value in cash plus 20% premium if you'll take the paper instead of gold. Some investors did that. A lot of them did not. And so what the gold traders did, in order to not have the commodities market collapsed by failing to deliver on the contract, is they started leasing gold from the central banks. And that was the gold that was used to make physical delivery on all of these gold futures contracts. And it was a good short-term solution, but the long-term ramifications were that as gold continued to go up and had to be suppressed by more of these gold futures contracts, they had to go on leasing gold from the private central banks, from the New York Federal Reserve Depository, Bank of England, Bank of France, to make good on the contracts. And now they're stuck because gold is still going up. They're still having to issue more of these contracts to try and keep it down. They're running out of physical gold to make delivery, and now all these other nations, Germany, Argentina, Mexico, are starting to say, we want to know our gold is really there and pure. And they're getting a stall from the central banks. Plus, I'm sure there's some back-channel communication saying, don't push this issue or we'll find a reason to invade you. But at some point, there's going to be a gold run on the banks. I mean, the very idea, when Germany started wanting to see their gold from the New York Federal Reserve, you had the financial editor of CNBC writing an editorial saying, it doesn't matter if the gold is really there or not, we've got it on paper and that's all that counts. That was a red warning flag. And that was followed up by the New York Federal Reserve saying it was going to take 7 or 8 years to return Germany's gold. The Bank of France was saying it was going to take 5 years, and the next week they're invading Mali, which is Africa's third largest gold producer. And now they're drooling over Venezuela, which is another major world gold producer. And so they've really painted themselves into a huge financial corner, and they're still trying to figure some way they can get out of it and make ordinary people around the world pay for it all.
Wow, they're in their own little world, ain't they?
Yes, they are.
In your opinion, Mike, what's the worst case? What's the worst case scenario that the end game that could possibly happen?
The worst case scenario is going to be open civil war across Europe and the United States, and I'm trying very hard to avoid that. The best case scenario is triggered by a default in Europe or some other. I mean, there's so many points of vulnerability of this whole global Ponzi scheme right now. It could come from virtually anywhere. But the idea is that all of these Federal Reserve systems come crashing down at the same time. They drag their governments with them, and we're able to basically say, all right, we got out of that mess. Let's form a new government and a new set of rules. And rule number 1 is no private central banking. Rule number 2 is no private central banking. Rule number 3 is no private central banking. Anybody who comes in here and says, I've got a private bank, let me run the nation's economy, we run them out of town on a rail after giving them a thick coat of tar and feathers. Because allowing private bankers to be in charge of a nation's economy makes about as much sense as having drug addicts in charge of your pharmacies.
Wow.
Pretty soon, all that anybody is getting are placebos. That's what a Federal Reserve note is. It's a placebo. It's not a unit of worth. It's a unit of debt.
Yeah. All right, Mike. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
You got it. Thank you for the phone call. Now, let's see. Let me back up here a little bit. A lot of people are very concerned about Obama's nomination for Secretary of Labor, Thomas Perez, because apparently he is not very pro-labor. He's very much tied in with the idea of driving down wages, salaries, and benefits. And it sort of ties in with Obama's policies so far, which are in fact destroying jobs, not creating them. Obamacare being the most obvious example. Companies all across America are being driven out of business by the new taxation. Other companies are having to let go of their full-time employees and hire them back as part-time employees to get around these very heavy financial costs for Obamacare. And all of this is the result of a political system that simply sells decisions to the highest bidder, and nobody's maintaining the overview. And that is supposed to be the federal government's job above all, maintaining the overview of what is best for the nation as a whole. And we don't have that, except for people like Ron Paul. And look how hard the money junkies work to keep him out of the nomination again. So over at Investment Watch blog again, they're looking at the recent run-up in the stock market. And they're drawing parallels to back in 2000, where these benchmark indices were just running up to a peak and then took a major dive afterwards. Saw a repeat in 2007. And they're saying it's, again, classic bubble. The smell of tulips is in the air. Really, if you have the surplus liquidity to be investing, you need to get into physical silver, physical gold, Republic Trading Group. They'll get you set up. Do not buy paper contracts for future delivery of gold. At some point, those will not be deliverable. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the number of food stamp recipients in the United States of America hit a record high in 2012. We don't have numbers yet for this year. Remember, the USDA was literally advertising for people to come onto food stamps. Why are they doing that? Well, very simply because if you're dependent on the government for food stamps, you're going to be less likely to stand up and say the government's doing something wrong. You're going to be less likely to stand up and oppose the gun grab. You're going to be less likely to stand up and oppose the government when they start grabbing other people's children to die in the money junkie wars. They want you dependent. Dependency is slavery. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And the corporate media, and certainly Wall Street itself, and the government are all trying to convince you the economy is doing great because the stock market is very, very high. And all those Wall Street bankers are just raking in the dough and huge bonuses. And they want you to believe that the economy is doing really well. Because look how well these people are doing. And if you're not doing as well as they are, well, it must be your own darn fault. But we can see there's a tremendous disconnect between the ultra-wealthy and the rest of the nation. The Dow is setting records, unless you factor in inflation, and then it's in decline, has been since 2000. But let's go with the official numbers. The Dow has set a record. So has food stamp usage. And if there is really so much financial wealth in this country, why do we have more people on food stamps than the entire population of Spain? Where is all the wealth going? And the reality is that Wall Street isn't doing well once you take away all of that instant money pouring out of the Federal Reserve. And the wealth is vanishing into all of this accumulated debt, which is created through an arbitrary set of rules. There is no science of banking. It's a religion. It's an arbitrary set of rules that you are brainwashed to believe in that serves the priesthood, the bankers. That's all it is. It's all make-believe. And it was sold to the government through corruption back in 1913. And it's fed to you in public schools to believe in. You're being taught this is the only way banking can operate. We know that's a lie. This nation fought a revolution to break free of private banks issuing the public currency as a loan at interest, only to have a corrupted government sell us back into the slavery of private bankers, not once, but 3 times. First Bank of the United States, Second Bank of the United States, and the Federal Reserve. And if you read my article, All Wars Are Banker Wars, you will see how those 3 private banks, their creation and subsequent dissolution, are tied in with wars this nation has fought. When Congress saw what the First Bank of the United States was doing to the American people, and they voted not to renew its charter, they were literally threatened by the Rothschilds that if they did not renew the charter, there would be war. And in 1811, Congress voted not to renew the charter of the First Bank of the United States. In 1812, Britain attacked. We would like to be a free nation and a free people. We'd like to believe that we live in the society we were told we believe in, but we don't. We live in a system of rule by debt slavery. And it is no more legitimate a form of government than rule by divine right or rule by slavery. And they're all based on belief. These systems only work if you believe this is the way life is supposed to be. And it's time to stop believing. It's time to be a bank heretic. To be more exact, a central bank heretic. So you can ignore what the corporate media is telling you about how, it's all coming together, it's all going to work out, don't worry. Because it isn't. Because the private central bankers do not exist to serve the nation, the community, the people, or even the government. Private central bankers throughout history without fail serve only themselves. That's why when Germany began to raise questions about their gold bullion at the New York Federal Reserve, the Bundesbank, Germany's private central bank, stood up and said, no, we believe the New York Federal Reserve. We don't need to look. They have no loyalty to the own countries in which they prey on the people. Their loyalty is to each other and to themselves. And the only good thing about economic globalism, it's an opportunity for all of these central banks to be brought down at the same time. Because if just one of these private central banks is allowed to survive, they will start the process all over again of subverting government after government to bring the world back under their system of manufactured debt slavery. It is the essence of the banking industry to keep everybody, whether nations or individuals, slaves to debt. That is how they rule. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, over in Libya, some interesting stories there. Apparently, Libya's interim leader was trying to leave a chaotic session of the National Assembly that was surrounded by protesters, and his car was fired on. He's not hurt, not been hit, but he was shot at. And because of this incident and the violence around the Libyan parliament is now shelving future sessions. Apparently, armed protesters actually stormed the assembly building. So it's looking to me like the people of Libya don't like their new U.S. puppet government and their new private central bank issuing the public currency as a loan at interest. Go figure. What's wrong with those people that they don't want to live their lives the way Americans do? So there may yet be a counter coup in Libya that will kick out the private central bank. Because life in Libya has definitely taken a major downturn for ordinary people since Gaddafi was killed and the gold dinar was destroyed, which was the real agenda. That's why they went into Libya. Gaddafi was talking about a state-controlled central bank and a value-based currency, the gold dinar. And he was going to sell Libya's oil for the gold dinar. And the private central bankers with their paper creation machines, they couldn't stand that. And so your kids got to go over to Libya. Your taxes were poured all over Libya to kick out this upstart ruler who wants to run his nation for the benefit of his own people and refuses to swear undying fealty to the money junkies. All wars are banker wars. They're all driven by the money junkies seeking greater wealth and willing to send 100 million of your children to horrible, painful deaths to do it. Forget about Al-Qaeda. Forget about incoming comets and asteroids. The common enemy of all mankind are private central banks issuing the public currency as a loan at interest. Now, one of the money junkies' targets, Hugo Chavez, speculation is still running rampant that he, along with several other of his sympathetic South American leaders, all seem to come down with cancer at the same time. And a video surfaced from back in 2010 where Hugo Chavez came out and said, Israel's Mossad is trying to kill me. Now, Chuck Hagel, apparently in response to this furious outcry regarding this new medal for drone pilots, this cyber warrior medal that would be given to these guys sitting in these air-conditioned offices in the heartland of America, playing with a joystick and killing people on the other side of the world. They were going to get a medal for valor and heroism that would outrank medals actually given on the battlefield. It was a huge outcry from civilians and military alike. Hagel has now ordered a halt to the production of this new medal. They're going to have a 30-day study about its feasibility and practicality. They may come out with something else that's a little decoration that won't outrank battlefield medals. But the idea of these drone pilots sitting in their little air-conditioned rooms, they get to go home to their families every night, having a medal that outranks battlefield decorations, it was absurd to begin with. I know why they did it. These drone pilots are dealing with a moral quandary because they are sitting in these air-conditioned, comfortable offices. And they do get to go home to their families every night. And they're just murdering people on the other side of the world. They're taking out, they know they're taking out 20 to 30 innocent civilians for any one, maybe a suspect, we don't know, we haven't actually had a trial for the guy yet. We're just killing him because he may not like us in the future. And these drone pilots are probably having a difficult time dealing with this. So they're going to give them a medal to make them feel good about what they're doing. That's what medals are really all about, to reassure the uniformed assassins that what they're doing is a good thing. That's why the Nazis were so big on medals and decorations. It was a way of reinforcing among their military, yes, what you're doing is okay. It's necessary. The government and God loves you for doing this. Here's a medal, so you can be proud of something that you might otherwise feel ashamed about. That's what a military decoration is for. So they were going to come up with this one for the drone pilots. The public outcry has been huge. Hagel has now put it on hold until they can figure another way to sell it to the American public. Now, over at Daily Bail, we're getting this story where in this latest trial for Occupy Wall Street protesters, it's now come out the New York Police Department lied under oath regarding this assault on one of the protesters. A video surfaced that proved the officer was lying under oath. I hope he gets hit with a perjury charge. And again, those guys in the uniforms and the badges and the guns and the tasers, they're not necessarily good people. Now, the ACLU in 23 states have filed more than 255 public records requests to determine the extent to which local police departments are now using federally subsidized military technology and tactics against the American people, tactics that we normally see deployed in foreign war zones. And it underscores the idea that Washington, D.C. seems to be of the opinion they're now at war with the 50 states, or they're preparing for war against the 50 states. Down in St. Petersburg, police shot and killed a man Sunday evening. They say was suicidal, and he was waving a pair of scissors around in a threatening manner. And they shot and killed the guy, which is a dandy way of dealing with suicides, I think. We're seeing that all across the country. The police are too ready, too eager to use those firearms. And again, how many of these police officers are on these prescription antidepressants that makes it psychologically easy to commit these acts of violence? Over at From the Trenches World Report, we're seeing a story about how more and more are turning to the militia movement. This ties in, of course, almost supports the Southern Poverty Law Center letter to Eric Holder, saying it's time to target America's patriot groups. They're enemies of the state. They're enemies of Israel. They're enemies of the government. This is a repeat of tactics that we saw in the 1980s, repeated in the 1990s, of trying to demonize anybody standing up and questioning the wisdom of government policy by calling them militias or white separatists or any other name they can think of. And by the way, you need to understand, many of these so-called militias out there are being run by the government itself in order to create incidents that the media can use to demonize anybody who's opposed to the government. There were a couple of scandals back, again, in the 1990s. There was a so-called Tri-States militia, and it turned out their communications director was an FBI informant. And you see this pattern all the way back to COINTELPRO in the 1960s, of the FBI either infiltrating or in some cases creating these groups in order to create newsworthy incidents to push the government's agenda. We've been seeing it in these last few years with all these so-called terror arrests where it turns out the FBI set up the terror plot, suckered somebody to come on board and say, yeah, I'll help you, boom, you're arrested, you're a terror suspect. Parade you all over the news. Then it goes to trial. The judge throws it out as obvious entrapment. That gets reported down on page 167 of your local town newspaper, where you're not going to see it. It's all about pushing the propaganda. Now, up in Washington State, there's a story that's breaking about this ex-con, Michael Boyson's 26 years old, had just served a 9-month sentence for a burglary conviction, was coming home. His grandparents threw him a welcome home party, and that later that night, Boyson killed his grandparents. Now he's on the run, possibly in the grandparents' car, and the police are sure he is heading to gun shows to buy guns. How could they possibly know that? They're trying to use this case to push the gun show part of the gun grabber agenda. And what they're not telling you in the headline stories, you dig a little, you'll find it. This guy was in jail for burglarizing pharmacies for OxyContin and other medications. Now, this pattern of just shooting the grandparents who just threw him a party, that's a classic violence pattern of somebody either on or withdrawing from prescription antidepressants. In his case, he may not have had a prescription. He just went into the pharmacies grabbing OxyContin because he can sell it, and happy pills that make him feel good. This aspect of the pharmaceutical link, of course, is not being reported on the corporate media. No more than they report on the fact that 90%, possibly more, of these mass shooters they're waving at you to support the gun grab agenda were also either on or withdrawing from prescription antidepressants. And anytime you hear anybody talking about taking away the guns because of the mass shootings, you might remind them, last year, drunk drivers killed 1,082 more people than gun owners did, and 2,000 of those gun deaths were suicides. Yet nobody talks about taking cars away from people who drive responsibly. The problem is a chemical, whether it's alcohol or SSRIs, that cause responsible people to act irresponsibly. Law-abiding gun owners and guns are being scapegoated, and part of the agenda is to protect a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry that is selling this medication into the general public. 10% of Americans are on these things. It is a bigger drug problem and a more dangerous drug problem than anything you're going to get from that shady guy under the street lamp down at the corner. And the gun grabbers, they're still trying to figure out some way they can do it. Apparently there's an incident out in California where a guy had to go into a mental hospital for 2 weeks, and as soon as he's home, the cops show up and confiscate all of his weapons. They're looking for any excuse. Next, they're going to declare anybody who disagrees with the government is mentally ill, just like the Soviet Union used to do, and they'll go around disarming people on that excuse. You can't have guns. You don't love your government. Now, over in Kentucky, the right to carry reform bill has passed the House. It's heading for the governor for signature. And sponsored by State Senator Brandon Smith. It eliminates several discriminatory and arbitrary provisions in Kentucky's current concealed carry laws. So Kentucky's moving in the right direction. They're going to let people carry concealed. And crime will go down, because it always, always has. Over in Arizona, they've just, an NRA-backed common sense reform bill has cleared the House of Representatives. And one of the provisions of the bill is it would require any firearms forfeited to or confiscated by a law enforcement agency to be sold to a federal firearms license holder. So the guns are going to go back into circulation. And the money raised from it would be used to basically fund more state activity. So they're basically saying guns that are forfeited or confiscated will not be destroyed. They will go back into circulation. So we're seeing all across the country these state legislators looking at ways to protect their people's ability to defend themselves against criminals and encroaching government. And if the federal government keeps pushing on this, it will provoke a crisis. And it may well be that's what the federal government wants. That's why they're buying all these tanks and all these hollow point bullets. They can't deal with 300 million Americans peacefully standing up and saying, we're not going to be your walking wallet any longer. We're not going to be your cash object. The federal government doesn't know how to deal with that. They don't know how to deal with people standing up with a First Amendment right to say no. They're preparing for a crisis. They may well foment one themselves. And again, my common sense advice to everybody listening to this show: do not initiate violence against the government. But prudence demands you be fully prepared to defend yourself when government initiates violence against you. Now, getting on to ClimateGate. Snow has triggered a huge 100-car pileup in Germany. Planes are grounded all across Europe. Huge, major winter storm. This is March. Northern France is paralyzed. People are trapped in their cars. Major blackouts. Travel chaos. They're calling it an unseasonably icy spell. It's cold. It's not supposed to be cold. This is March. This is supposed to be the start of spring. Frankfurt Airport was closed. They finally got one runway open for takeoffs only. Storm is so bad they can't land aircraft there. 33 Spanish provinces are on high alert for snow and strong winds. Switzerland is setting record cold temperatures. Let's see. Mercury plunged to minus 29.4 degrees in Buffalora. minus 27.3 in Samadan, and minus 20.4 degrees in Davos. Temperature dropped to minus 36 degrees in Glattelp, I think that's pronounced. Record cold, record cold, record cold. Ireland is planning a white St. Patrick's Day from their snow. They've got snowmen dolled up in the green. This human-caused global warming story, myth, was a hoax. And still, they're pushing this Kool-Aid on the world. More about that when we come back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And we're talking about raising on a busted flush by the carbonazis. And the reality is, Mother Nature has not cooperated with the agenda to convince the world they have to pay carbon taxes and buy carbon credits and submit to a global environmental authority, because all of the dire prognostications of the carbonazis have fallen flat on their face. Back in 2000 was in the media. Snow was a thing of the past. Tell that to all those people in Germany who can't get to their destinations today. And spring officially begins in a little more than a week. But the fact is that it's been a moving target. Whatever's going on, it's the fault of global warming. That's how they're trying to sell it. In fact, I saw this story earlier on the corporate media where they're talking about this algae bloom in the Gulf of Mexico and how it has come in unusually close to the coast of Florida, and it's resulted in the deaths of a great number of manatees. And the expert they had on their show was saying, well, it's very unusual for it to come this close to the coast. We don't know why. My personal opinion would be that you might want to look at those billions of gallons of oil and Corexit that poured into the Gulf not too long ago from the Deepwater Horizon. But the corporate media bimbo chimed in and said, could it be caused by global warming? It's like they have a little list taped to their desk, always keep coming back to these topics. Could it be caused by global warming? And the expert was saying, well, really, there doesn't seem to be a link to that. But it's automatic. They're still pushing global warming, global warming, global warming. And there was another story. This was on CNN. Allergy sufferers are going to be harmed by global warming because global warming will bring on more pollen. And they're just using anything that they can hook. By the way, if global warming is going to bring on more pollen, it means there are more plants and there's more food for a starving planet. But that's a bad thing because the allergy sufferers. Don't worry, we have a prescription medication to give that to you. But the reality is, this is busted. And for anybody speaking of pollen, for anybody who's out there saying that the government would lie about anything that important or that big, yeah, they do. This whole global warming hoax, hysteria, is proof. Government will lie to you to get your money, to get your obedience. They've been doing it all along. There is no other explanation for why NASA, NOAA, Penn State, Hadley, CRU, IPCC, the United Nations, all of these organizations 10 years ago were screaming global warming, carbon tax, carbon tax. And nothing they warned was going to happen has come true. They were lying. Deal with it. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And I'm going to finish up one more item on ClimateGate and the global warming fraud, which is what it is. And then we're going to take a phone call here. Even to this very moment, those scientists who sold out their principles for global warming funding are still out there insisting that Greenland and Antarctica are melting down, pouring massive amounts of water into the sea and drowning the coasts. The latest sea level measurements from California show that sea level has actually declined slightly. And we know that Greenland, contrary to the claims made by the former head of Greenpeace 10 years ago, isn't losing its ice sheet. 10 years ago, he predicted in 20 years all of Greenland's ice would be gone. We're halfway through that time period. Greenland still has all of its ice. In fact, it has a little bit more, according to the latest data. And this former head of Greenpeace was forced to finally admit on camera, on video interview, that, well, no, it wasn't really losing the ice. We just needed to motivate people to support our agenda. Paul Watson, who's very famous for chasing the Japanese whaling ships around Antarctica, is on record as saying it doesn't matter what's real. What matters is what people believe. They're running it as a religion. Why are sea levels in decline? Well, it may be because the Arctic ice sheet is setting a new record for expanse. All of the scientific data that is not being filtered through the carbonazis is showing the world going into a cooling trend, and we know why. NASA has confirmed the sun is not going to have a maximum this year, although it's supposed to. We're in a repeat of the Maunder minimum, which triggered the little ice age in Europe. And I'm sure right now a lot of people in Europe are thinking it has already started. Going to go to the phones here. Malcolm in Austin. Aloha. Malcolm, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. I just, by the way, great show. I just emailed you a piece from National Bankruptcy, While the Middle Class is Doomed, about von Mises' definition of what's called the crack-up boom. Mm-hmm. And von Mises was Ron Paul's main economic influence. And if you read this, I think this is what's going on right now. It's the final credit bliss before the crash.
I see your email, and I will look at it, and I would tend to agree, because none of these Ponzi scheme debt-based currencies can perpetuate. There is a fatal design flaw in the system, which inevitably leads to collapse. And yes, I think it is at hand.
Anyway, it's an interesting read, and keep up the good work.
All right, thanks an awful lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443, and I think maybe it's Dan is in the control room now. I may or may not be right. He'll let me know. Over in Japan, they have succeeded in extracting natural gas from sub-ocean deposits of methane hydrate. Now, methane hydrate is a very interesting substance. You can actually find bits of it occasionally floating on the surface of the ocean. And it looks like a white sherbet. And when you pick it up, it's fizzing, and you can set fire to it. And it's basically gaseous methane and water, which under pressure forms a clathrate that forms this substance. And it is an amazing source of methane. The methane comes from deep crust microbes that produce methane constantly as part of their biological processes. And this methane, under heat and pressure, can form petroleum, which can then form coal. And in shallower depths, it forms methane hydrate. But there is a downside to this breakthrough, and I'll explain when we come back from these commercials. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And we're talking about Japan's announcement that they have successfully extracted natural gas from frozen methane hydrates below the ocean floor off of its central coast. And this is something that a lot of people have been thinking about. And the idea is you drill down into there, you pump super hot water down there to melt the methane hydrate, and all of a sudden there's an abundance of natural gas coming back up. Sounds like huzzah, huzzah. There's all the energy we could need for the immediate future at least. But there is a problem, and I'm surprised that Japan, of all nations right now, would not be concerned about it. The methane hydrate deposits underneath these continental shelves are huge and vast. And if you're sucking out the natural gas and melting the methane hydrate, you are creating these huge voids under the ocean floor, which at some point can collapse. And what happens when you have a giant undersea movement of dirt? You get the large tsunamis. Looking back through geological history, earthquakes will produce some nasty tsunamis, but the biggest tsunamis come from massive undersea landslides. And so I understand why in the short term this is a cheap source of energy, and congratulations for the technology, but there needs to be some caution and care, because there is a risk involved in this. All right, we're going to go to the phones here. We've got Jim in Michigan. Aloha, Jim. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. And about global warming, I'm not from Michigan, really. You know that. I moved down south 38 years ago to get away from Buffalo, New York. And this has been the coldest winter that I have ever seen since I've lived down here. Normally 2 weeks after December it would be cold, and after that you'd have 3 or 4 nice days and then a few cold days. So there's no such thing as global warming. I haven't seen I get up at 2, 3 in the morning and I haven't seen the stars maybe twice in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Clouds, the clouds and cold and overcast. Getting to the economy.
Before we get to the economy, I want to respond to what you said. We're noticing here in Hawaii, it is the coldest it's ever been since we moved here. And yes, there's a lot of cloud formation. I was out last night trying to get a picture of Comet Pan-STARR, and earlier in the day, no clouds, and then they just kept forming. When you have the sun in a very quiet cycle, you get more cloud formation. That's the mechanism by which the sun really does control the Earth's climate, because when you have a lot of solar activity and everything's stirred up, it prevents cosmic rays from getting too deep into the Earth's atmosphere. And when the sun is very quiet, as it is right now, this is supposed to be the year of the solar maximum, and it's not happening. But when you have a quiet sun, more of these rays get down lower in the atmosphere, and they stimulate cloud formation. And CERN just reconfirmed this with an experiment about a couple of months back. And if you've ever been in a physics class, you've probably seen something called a cloud chamber, where they use a super saturated atmosphere, usually alcohol. And every time one of those cosmic rays zips through, you'll see this brief little trail form. And the same thing is happening in the atmosphere. And so when you have a quiet sun, more clouds are being formed. The more clouds they are, the more sunlight gets reflected back into space without warming the Earth, and the Earth gets colder. And yes, there is a link between solar activity and cloud formation. A lot of clouds this year. World is getting colder.
Well, you get more education than I do. I don't understand most of that, but all I know is I'm out in the morning, anytime from 2 to 3 in the morning, and I haven't seen the stars twice in 3 weeks, so. And then the one night was just partially, so. But I wanted to get to the economy as far as, I've been retired since November, and now I go to the store 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more, and get bread and milk. And I just get tickled that I have people in front of me with buggies that are over the top full with groceries, and of course we get peanut butter and bread and bologna and stuff like that, and I get in line behind these people, and I don't take it from them. I know that they've got it coming, but then when I get in line behind them, they're eating steak and stuff that I can't afford, and then they pull out food stamp cards, and that just gets me. I'm 67, and I get steak maybe once every 6 months. So,
well, I'm not. I have to tell you. I have to tell you, in all honesty. Well, I've had people call in with this before, and my wife and I are involved with dealing with the food insecure here in Hawaii, and I've never seen that. Okay, to be very honest, my experience here is that the food stamp money tends to run out in week number 3 of the month, and there's a lot of hardship. Now, there may be some people who have fraudulently qualified themselves for food stamps and are using them on top of their own salaries, wages, or bank accounts or whatever to live high on the hog. But it certainly is not the normal. And again, the food stamp money that is out there is insufficient if that's all people have to live on.
And but when they're eating better than me and then they're paying with food stamps, it kind of gets my gall, so.
Well, you may be looking at somebody engaged in fraud. They may have gotten the food stamps fraudulently, and there's a lot of that going on. So,
well, Michael, I've noticed this quite a bit since November because, like I say, my wife gives me a grocery list and I go, but
well, we're not seeing it here. Got to let you go. Running out of time, and I got a few more topics I want to get to before the end of the show. Yes, there are people who abuse the system, who think they're owed, that anything they do to get themselves goodies is a survival skill. And there are people who will take advantage of these programs unfairly, fraudulently. It's definitely out there, and unfortunately, the budget for enforcement to make sure that these people really do have this demonstrated need, is simply not there. There are people who will game the system, take advantage of it, get their free cell phones, get the food stamps. They don't really qualify for it. It's a reality. But my experience being involved with the food insecure here on Oahu is that the people I see who are on food stamps aren't making it all the way through the month. And so I think that experience of a huge full shopping cart and food stamps is the exception, not the norm. And that you're probably dealing with somebody who's gamed the system somehow to their own benefit. And they're there. And it's nothing new about that. Many years ago when I was still living with my family, and they owned a small block of apartments in Azusa, California, and I was their unpaid building manager. We had a woman there who was just milking the system from welfare and every other assistance and just had money rolling in, most of which went for alcohol and drugs. Every 9 months she had another kid. She was unmarried. She'd go down to welfare and say, I've got another kid. And they'd say, all right, we're going to raise your check. There are people who will take advantage of that system. But we're going to have to turn a blind eye to those people gaming the system because we don't want to hurt the ones who are legitimately in need and struggling just to feed their family. All right. Now then, a couple of interesting stories came in over the last commercial break. You remember Gabby Giffords? She's like the poster girl for gun control and gun bans and let's get rid of the assault weapons. Apparently, somebody caught her husband buying an AR-15. I love the smell of burning hypocrite in the morning. And we see this. Dianne Feinstein, she carries concealed, but she doesn't want you to have guns. All the politicians have bodyguards and Secret Service and hired security. They feel they have a legitimate need for protection. They know the police aren't going to help them. They don't want you to have guns. It's just amazing. Somebody, one of our members over at whatreallyhappened.com put up this interesting little graph about the U.S. homicide rate from 1885 to 2012. And it shows basically number of homicides per unit of population, so it's a per capita measurement that negates the effects of population growth. And it confirms something that I was telling you some time ago. During the Wild West, homicides were actually very low because everybody was carrying a gun. The periods of maximum homicides were during Prohibition, various other times like that. The homicide rate in the United States has been in decline for the last several years. But all of a sudden today, guns are a problem. Guns must be grabbed. Guns must be taken away. It's got nothing to do with crime prevention. The government is afraid of you. They're very afraid of you. They're in a state of panic, trying to figure out how they can keep this failed system going a little bit longer until it's somebody else's problem to ride out the disaster. Because nobody in Washington, D.C. wants to go down in the history books as the congressman or the president who presided over the final collapse. So they just kick the can forward a little bit more. And I got to tell you, that can has been kicked so much, it's not recognizable as a can any longer. Looks like a crumpled piece of aluminum foil. All right, we're coming down to the end of the segment. Going to take a commercial break here, and the phone lines are open again, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Got some health and science stories to talk about when we come back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Interesting story just now coming in. You've been hearing about Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, which Israel is developing and building eventually for export, and you, the American taxpayer, are paying for. And during the most recent attack by Israel into Gaza, they were crowing about how Iron Dome hit 84% of the targets that it engaged. We already know this number is fake because Hamas fired less than 200 rockets into Israel, and Israel responded with thousands of these Iron Dome rockets. And so obviously there's a disconnect there. But now we have Professor Theodore Postel of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology saying that according to his analysis, Iron Dome is not effective. And he holds up as his precedent the claims made about the U.S. Patriot missile system, which was lauded as hitting 90% of the incoming targets during Operation Desert Storm, but in hindsight only appears to have actually worked once. And according to Professor Postel, his analysis is showing that Israel's Iron Dome system only hit its intended target somewhere around 5 to 10% of the time. And the reason there wasn't much damage in Israel is because the Hamas rockets are unguided, simply zigzagged around the sky until they ran out of fuel and fell down. So it's another reminder that what you're hearing from government and the corporate media shouldn't be taken at face value. Alrighty, let's see. Now getting on to the health issues. Of course, we're all still talking about how a judge has struck down Mayor Bloomberg's big gulp ban. And probably it's going to be the beginning of the erosion of all of his other nanny state laws that he's trying to get passed regarding no 2-liter bottles with pizzas and all the rest of that stuff. And we know what's really going on. New York City has 50,000 homeless. It has an economy that outside of Wall Street is an absolute disaster. Wall Street's this little tiny protected enclave. It's the Emerald City or the Gold City. They're doing really well. Everybody else is in trouble. Bloomberg can't do a thing about the real problems. And so he's trying to prove he's relevant by tinkering with people's lifestyles. And it reminds me very much, there was this funny Chevy Chase movie, Sigourney Weaver was in it, Gregory Hines was in it, did a fabulous job. It was called Deal of the Century, and it was a comedy about this arms dealer, this arms salesman, who's down in this South American country selling new weapons for war. And the leader of the South American country has to go on TV and tell his people that, I'm sorry, taxes are going to have to go up, and it's all the fault of those women who are wearing slacks in the workplace. And I'm going to pass a law saying women must wear dresses in the workplace. And in the movie, in the context, you laugh and you realize what an absolute joke it is. But here you have Mayor Bloomberg doing exactly the same thing. He can't deal with the homeless problem. He can't solve the economic problems. He won't stand up to Wall Street. So he's going to prove what a butch ruler he is by going out and saying you may not have too large of a soft drink in your hand. And I'm not saying he's wrong about sugar and artificial sweeteners, but it really is just a dodge. It's a distraction from all the real problems that we're seeing in that city. Now, interesting story coming out of CBS in Charlotte. Is Kraft macaroni and cheese actually making children sick? Now, this is a problem that's been a product that's been around since 1937. And when I was a kid, I had mac and cheese. I love this stuff, or I used to. I don't eat it anymore because I'm on a diet. We grew up with that stuff. It's an icon. And it was sold to us at a time when nobody was ever suspicious or questioning about the chemicals that were in the food. And now, apparently, people are starting to take a close look at the ingredients of Kraft macaroni and cheese, and they're finding a lot of stuff in there that is not good for children to be eating. our food is being adulterated during these hard economic times, whether it's horse meat in what we think is beef, additives and fillers. Somebody was sending me this article about American Shred. It's a new food topping, and it's basically just potato starch with cheese flavoring that you put on your food. It won't even melt like real cheese. We're in this soylent era of food production in this country. Soylent yellow, soylent brown. Remember, soylent green is made out of people. Because of the Gulf of Mexico disaster, because of Fukushima, because of lowered crop yields in GMO crops, the massive diversion of farmlands to mandated ethanol production. 1/3 of all corn in America is now going to ethanol production. We don't have enough food to feed the human race. And so we're getting all these fillers and junk that isn't good nutrition. They just make it taste good and hope you won't notice the difference. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And the corporate media is still going on and on about conclave, even though they've had one vote, no pope. The Cardinals have basically quit for the evening. It's nighttime over there. And they're going on and on about all the security, not just to protect the Cardinals, but to make sure the Cardinals can't communicate with the outside world. They've got jamming devices because the Cardinals could have, spy devices hidden in those funny little hats that they wear. And I understand the bookmakers could make a huge profit if they know which way the votes are going. But again, this is being used to conditize us all. And I understand for the Catholics out there, this is an important thing to be going on, but there's not going to be another vote till tomorrow. And this is just another excuse for the corporate media to not be reporting on the things that really do affect the lives of every single American. Now, NASA has announced over at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, they've got the Curiosity rover running again following its computer glitch from a while back. And they're finally starting to drill out and analyze samples of the rocks. And NASA has announced they find conditions once suited for ancient life on Mars. And they're showing the rock contains sulfur, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and carbon. Well, we've already known this from earlier probes to Mars. And they seem to be hemming and hawing. They're talking about ancient life on Mars. Could have once supported life. And they seem to be dancing around the issue about whether there's something there now or not. And remember, shortly after Curiosity landed and they were driving around, it was leaked out they had found something that was going to change the science textbooks. And then a week later they said, nope, nothing there. Nothing at all. Now, longtime listeners know that I worked on the Viking missions to Mars back in 1976, 77, 78. And they know I've had Dr. Gilbert Levin on the show, who designed the labeled release experiment, which indicated life on Mars. And NASA, under political pressure, caved in, ignored the positive result, and went with a negative finding from the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer to say there was no life on Mars. We know now, because of later probes analyzing the soil chemistry, the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer on Viking could never have worked to detect organic molecules, because the Martian soil is very high in perchlorates. And when you have perchlorates mixed with organic molecules and you heat them, the perchlorates tear those molecules apart. That's how chlorine bleach disinfects and kills germs. Simple chemistry. And we're seeing this hemming and hawing where they talk about signs of life on Mars, but it's always in the context of long ago. Couldn't possibly be now. And I'm beginning to think what's going on here. Now, back during Viking, it was basically all of these religious people were calling their congressmen and saying there can't be life on Mars because it's not in the Bible. And members of Congress were calling NASA and saying, if you say there's life on Mars, we're going to have to rethink your funding. And NASA caved in. Now, given that we know the results from the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer on Viking were invalid, was a false negative, given the positive on the labeled release experiment, and that technology was not experimental on Viking. Dr. Levin originally developed this technology to test civic water systems for bacterial infection. It is reliable, it is robust, it is used the world over. And it got a positive result. So based on that positive and the fact that the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer was nonsense, I think any reasonable objective observer is going to say that Viking did find life on Mars. And I think Curiosity probably has found indications, but I think the political decision has been made to not allow anything out into the public that might cause a socially transformative event, that might take our focus off the designated enemies and the rush to war and the worship of the money junkies. Because I think when the people of planet Earth understand beyond all doubt that we are not alone in this universe, definitively, not abstractly, not theoretically, but as an absolute provable fact, it's going to change everybody's perspective on our place on planet Earth, our place in the universe. We might all of a sudden say, let's put down our bayonets and let's look out there and find who else is really out there. And I think because right now our government's goal is to keep us all focused on hate the Muslims, hate the Muslims, hate the Muslims. They don't want anything to distract from that. And my gut level is that Curiosity has found a lot more than we are being told. And as was the case with Viking, it is being dismissed and rejected not because of scientific evidence, but because of political considerations. Now, a while back, there were these scientists who identified what they reported as microfossils in meteors. And they were publishing some very convincing micrographs. They've now published a second paper saying they found additional microfossils in meteor fragments. And they're being dismissed. They're saying it's poor methodology, blah, 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 blah. And we need to be careful because these scientists are pushing the idea of panspermia, which is that life was seeded to Earth from other places, which sounds suspiciously like a new Big Bang theory. There is a God, he worked through the meteors. But life has to begin spontaneously someplace. Why not here? And we need to get away from this idea that science is subordinate to politics, because it leads us to some very bad mistakes. ClimateGate being one of them. Many of these nations in Europe, in the northern latitudes, are hard-pressed to deal with these harsh winters we've been getting because previous administrations cut the funding for snowplows, snowplow maintenance, road grit. All of the preparations for a hard winter were cut back on this promise that snow would be a thing of the past. And now these areas are struggling to deal with these hard winters. And they are suffering because of it. And this is what happens when science is held subordinate to politics. Whether it's ClimateGate, vaccine science, the severity of the Deepwater Horizon disaster, the severity of Fukushima. We are the most lied to people on the face of planet Earth, and you should be angry about that. You should be furious. Nowhere in the Constitution of the United States of America is the government given the authority to lie to you. when the government lies to you about anything, even Bill Clinton's Big Mac, they're acting illegally and unconstitutionally. They have delegitimized themselves. We cannot live under a government that lies to us, because we are being blinded to what's really going on in the world. They hate us for our freedoms. No, they don't. They hate us because we're messing around in their countries and looting their wealth to prop up our Ponzi scheme bank. At some point, the American people have to lose what's left of their denial. They have to realize the scale that they have been lied to take away their wealth, their freedoms, the lives of their children, and they have to get angry. And it is time to get angry. And it is time to start standing up to every single politician, every corporate media spokesperson, every banker, every clergy who is lying, and denounce them for it. And say, you lied to us before, you are lying again. I will not believe you anymore. There is no law that says you must believe what the government tells you or what the corporate media tells you. As we've already documented, there is no law that says the corporate media has to tell you the truth. And because of that Fox News synthetic bovine growth hormone lawsuit, the legal precedent is corporate media can instruct their prostitutes to lie to you, and if they refuse to do so, they can be fired legally. Which is why that bimbo earlier today, in response to the story about the manatees, was saying, oh, was it the fault of global warming? Just absurd. Now, Russia, in response to that huge wallop that fell out of the sky a while back, is now starting to work on what they hope will be an anti-meteorite shield. I can see a few engineering problems with that, mostly having to do with the solid mass of the incoming debris and whether you want it to come down in a single lump or as a shotgun blast scattered across the countryside. But they are starting to seriously look at that, and it is the next step. All this money has been spent on all these telescopes to keep watch around the Earth, looking out for these bits of flotsam and jetsam that go whizzing by, although nobody saw the one that hit Russia coming in, or the one that whizzed by Earth last Saturday. They only spotted that one 4 days ahead of time. So there's some improvement there. But at least the Russians are trying to deal with a real problem, a real threat, and not just making something up out of thin air, like global warming, to then sell you a solution to in exchange for higher taxes and your obedience. Now, speaking of being lied to about Fukushima, we just passed the 2-year anniversary of that. When it was happening, we reported on our website and on our radio show that the explosion of reactor number 3 was not steam. That was the official story coming from TEPCO, Japan, General Electric, and the U.S. corporate media. It was just a steam explosion. Steam is white. The cloud coming out of this explosion was this sickly yellow-green, which is the color of the quadrivalent form of plutonium oxide. Now, 2 years later, they're admitting the reactor vessels were breached, cracked, there's melted reactor fuel down in the ground, and now they're estimating up to 47 quadrillion becquerels of cesium-137 flowed into the Pacific. That's 50 times more than TEPCO originally told us. We're getting all this kind of debris from Fukushima up on the shores of Oahu. I got to go down and get a piece for the debris collection. But it was a major disaster, way past Chernobyl. Fukushima is the world's worst nuclear disaster. And it's having an impact. We just got word that apparently the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission has denied a permit for a new reactor out of concerns over where it was being built and the potential for harm. What we need to be looking at is thorium cycle reactors. They're much safer. Thorium is abundant. You're not going to have to fight wars over it. You don't have anywhere near the nuclear waste problem that you see up in Hanford. course, you can't make bombs out of it also, which is a loss to places like Israel and the United States that love to have lots of these bombs. I think we should be looking at developing a thorium cycle nuclear power plant for commercial shipping, to drive those huge ships all over the planet without burning up all the fossil fuels that the carbonazis are screaming about. We don't have the money to develop that technology because it's all been poured all over Wall Street to prop up the Ponzi scheme. And that is perhaps the biggest crime committed against the American people. Our future was looted to pay for the crimes of the past. Instead of taking that $20-40 trillion worth of money to save the banking system from its own self-made disaster, if they had put that into developing new technologies, the U.S. would be a technological leader. But the government sold out our future to pay for past crimes so that the bankers wouldn't have to go to jail. Going to go to the phones. Michael in North Carolina. Aloha, Michael. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, aloha, Michael. How are you?
Doing fine.
I called initially to talk about corporate media. I had an instance. I was out of town this week and spent some time in South Carolina. And I was sitting in the motel lobby ordering breakfast, and I watched a couple as they viewed CNN.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really strange because I was not watching, and I was reading actually a journal article. So I'm watching them watch the TV, and then I got like entranced watching them, and it was nothing. I mean, it was just all infotainment, and they loved it.
Mm-hmm.
They were laughing, and they were talking amongst themselves, and oh my God, I love her. Oh, I follow her Twitter. I was just like, holy moly.
Well, now CNN did it to themselves. I mean, right now, a big part of their audience share are motel lobbies, airline terminals, and post office lobbies. That's where they're getting most of their viewer numbers that they're selling to their advertisers. But yeah, they've gone the bimbo route. They've gone the tabloid route. Next thing, they're going to have a page 3 girl. You know, and that's why they're losing their audience. And again, according to Rasmussen, as of last week, more Americans are now coming to the independent media than are getting their news from the traditional corporate news channels. And that's why we don't use the term mainstream to describe them anymore. They're the corporate media. We're the independent media. We're not alternative. We're the new mainstream right here. Got to take a break for commercials. Thank you for the call, Mike. We'll be back with the end segment of our show after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. A couple of stories to finish up today's program with. Out in Orange County, California, there's this Girl Scout, Alicia Serratos, and she has started a petition drive to ask that Girl Scout cookies no longer be made with GMO ingredients. And I think this is a very good idea because while Monsanto can control the corporate media, and the legislators, they can't control the grassroots. And more people are standing up and saying, we don't want your designer genes in our food. As reported earlier, Whole Foods is going to start having mandatory GMO labeling in their stores, starting in, one report said 2014, another one said 2018. People are asking, why is it taking that long? Well, Whole Foods, like any other large chain, has long-duration contracts with their suppliers. And so they're going to have to wait for some of these contracts to expire, and then when they renegotiate new contracts, they're going to say, by the way, got to be labeled whether it's GMO or not. So that's why it's going to take a while for that to happen. So there's nothing suspicious about that. It's just normal ways of doing business here. A lot of people are starting to call attention to the fact that microbes that formerly were handled quite well by antibiotics are evolving rapidly to be resistant. And they're starting to see more and more of what they're calling the superbugs that are absolutely immune to these antibiotics. And they're starting to plague hospitals. And when antibiotics first came out, I remember there were cautionary voices that said, these are good, but let's not overuse them, because the microbes might evolve a resistance. But when the money junkies are making the decision, they got a new product, sell as much of it as they can, recommend it for every possible use, even when it's not appropriate. We saw the same thing with Roundup. The Roundup Ready crops. Plant these, you'll never have weeds again. 5, 6 years later, they've got weeds worse than before, and the weeds will not succumb to the Roundup. So they're back to dosing their GMO crops with the very same powerful and toxic pesticides they were using before Roundup came along. Nature does not sit still when you get out there and you come up with a new chemical or a new gene and you put it onto the marketplace. It's not going to react the way it did in the laboratory under controlled conditions. The real world is going to respond. We're seeing that over and over. The BBC is now reporting antibiotic resistance is as big a problem as terrorism. Actually, considering how much of terrorism is a fake, I'd say that this antibiotic-resistant problem is bigger. It's a real threat. Let's see if they can actually deal with it. By the way, for those of you out there still insisting that your Macs are safe against viruses, apparently the latest Mac malware that infected Facebook went right by the OS X gatekeeper protection. On that note, I hear the music. It's time to get on out of here and get something useful done with the afternoon. We'll be back here tomorrow on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay well. Share what you know with who you know. Stay skeptical, get angry. Please support Republic Broadcasting. Don't forget Republic Trading Group if you're trying to get into silver and gold. Please just be kind to all of your friends. Help those in need, and aloha, America.